Good morning. I'm Lisa Schiltz. I'm reaching you live from my home office in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nicola Center's Winter Conference, We Belong to Each Other. The panel that I have the privilege of moderating today is called The Face of Mercy, What We Owe to Those with Disabilities. I'll be introducing our panelists, and then we're going to have some time to listen to their opening comments, followed by some conversation among the panelists, and then there'll be time for questions and answers from the audience. You can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time to submit a question to us, and we'll collect your questions and pose them at the end of the session. So I would like to jump right into my introduction of our panelists so I don't waste any of our precious time together. Our first speaker is Joshua Diehl, and he's the Chief Program Officer for Child and Adolescent Services at LOGAN Center in South Bend, Indiana, which supports people with intellectual and developmental disabilities so that they, their family, and their families can achieve their desired quality of life. He's also a faculty fellow of the Master of Autism Studies program at St. Mary's College, as well as a senior research associate at the University of Notre Dame. He received his undergraduate degree in psychology from Princeton and his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Rochester, where he was a fellow in the program in leadership on education in neurodevelopmental disorders. He also did a postdoc at the Yale Child Studies Center. His current research focuses on supporting both the individual with autism and his or her family. His work on the clinical uses of robots for ASD treatment has been featured on NBC, MSNBC, PBS, WebMD, and in the Wall Street Journal. Our second panelist is Mary O'Callaghan, and she is a developmental psychologist and a public policy fellow at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. She received her PhD from Notre Dame under a grant from the National Institute of Health to study developmental disabilities. Dr. O'Callaghan works on ethical and policy issues related to individuals with disabilities, in particular, prenatal diagnosis and disability-selective abortion. Her policy work has included testifying before the Indiana and Kentucky state legislatures in support of disability-selective abortion bans. She has also testified before the United Nations concerning the scope of international abortions of children with Down syndrome. She serves on the Human Rights Committee of Logan Industries. In addition, she's the co-founder of and a volunteer for Miriam's Blessing, a diocesan perinatal hospice program, which supports parents who receive poor prenatal diagnoses. Next, we have Michael Waddell, who holds the Edna and George McMahon Aquinas Chair in Philosophy at St. Mary's College, where he also directs the Master of Autism Studies program. For the last several years, his work is focused on bringing philosophical and theological theories of human nature, ethics, philosophy of religion, and the Catholic intellectual tradition into conversation with the emerging field of the philosophy of disabilities. As a part of these efforts, he has taught courses in philosophy and disabilities and has lectured on philosophy and autism at prominent universities throughout the world, including Oxford and Cambridge. Closer to home, he serves on the Human Rights Committee of Logan Industries and participates in ministries for people with disabilities. He's currently working on a book on autism and the Catholic tradition. Now, one of the things that binds all of the panelists and myself is that we also all have the personal experience of a family member with a disability whom we have grown to love from birth onwards. So we have people that have not only professional but personal expertise in the areas that they're going to be discussing, and it's going to be an exciting ride. So let us turn right now to our first panelist and get off to a good start with Josh.
Well, hello, everyone, and I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. As you heard, I wear a lot of different hats. Right now I'm in charge of developing and overseeing programs for people with autism and developmental disabilities at a local nonprofit that serves a pretty large region and a large number of people with developmental disabilities and their families. I also am blessed to fulfill the role as a teacher, as a faculty fellow within the St. Mary's program and work with developing some of the future leaders within the field, and kind of changing and challenging the way that we think about autism and other developmental disabilities. And third, I think having research is an important part of a well-rounded life within this type of field. And so a big part of what I do is conducting research on developing programs to support families of people with developmental disabilities. And we have an NIH grant to support that. But what's interesting is I feel like with all these hats, the thing that most has influenced me has been a fourth hat that I wear, which is my brother was born with a developmental disability. So I wear the SIB hat, and he's kind of an interesting, I want to give you a little context on him because of the way he has influenced my own thinking. He was born with significant and multiple delays. And when he was 4 years old, my parents were told by the doctor that they should prepare for the fact that he was going to be a burden on our family, and they were eventually going to need to give him up to the state, that they weren't going to be able to care for him. So that's a lot to say about a 4-year-old that has, a few delays. So my parents didn't like that, and so they fought to have him be the first child who's mainstreamed into general education in our county. And he's been an incredible success story. He has a job. He's living in a supported living home with his best friends, and he has a girlfriend. And I can tell you that he definitely has not been a burden on our family at all. In fact, when I was asked the question, like, what do we owe people with developmental disabilities? The first thing that I thought was, man, what do I owe my brother? And that's just one person. He has given me love and direction and inspiration and purpose. So what do I owe? It's a heck of a lot. But broadly speaking, these experiences have defined my career, but also the way I think about what we owe people with disabilities. And I think there's simple themes that are harder than they should be to achieve. And for me, I really see two interrelated themes. One, simply put, is equal access to the community. And the second one is the ability for individuals to achieve their desired quality of life. Now, I feel like there are a number of important milestones that we've reached as a community and as a culture in achieving these goals. And, the access to free and appropriate public education for all, the Americans with Disabilities Act. But there's a lot that still needs to be done. And speaking in terms of a theme, I think a big obstacle that we have right now is awareness of disabilities without knowledge. We know somebody has a disability, they have autism, or they have something. But I don't think we take the time to know and understand what it actually means to the person, what it means to the community. And I think that this in itself creates isolation and intolerance. So a lot of what I hope to bring to the conversation is how we take these themes and practically take steps to improve access to the community and the ability to achieve your desired quality of life.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I'm sure as the conversation continues, we'll hear a lot more from you about some of those practical tips. Mary, would you like to continue this conversation for us?
Absolutely, Lisa. It's good to be here with all of you today. What I thought I would do is offer some reflections from the vantage point of my own work in prenatal diagnosis of disability and abortion, in hopes that it will offer some helpful insights into the question of what we owe those with disabilities. When I was in graduate school some 30 years ago, the hope and excitement in the field of disabilities was palpable. We were at the tail end of a century where those with disabilities had been subjected to the policies of eugenics and institutionalization, and we were looking forward really to a future of equality and inclusion. Both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act were passed when I was a grad student. Both furthering and securing the rights and dignity of those with disabilities, a seeming culmination of the disability rights movement that had gained full stream in the 1960s. The object of this legislation certainly was not just to secure rights, but also to change attitudes towards those with disabilities. And if we take the current media as one barometer of public opinion towards those with disabilities, it could appear that we've been pretty wildly successful. We see actors with disabilities in mainstream television shows, models with disabilities in clothing ads. A few years ago, for goodness sake, the Gerber baby of the year had Down syndrome. Every fall, we're treated to heartwarming stories of a boy with Down syndrome who scores the winning touchdown, etc. It appears that overall, then, we've made great progress in our attitudes towards and treatment of those with disabilities. Except when you know the troubling fact that there has been a very different trajectory in prenatal medicine, which also had its origins in the 1960s when the American Medical Association passed a resolution endorsing abortion, and I quote here, in cases where an infant may be born with incapacitated physical deformities or mental deficiency. So as practices and policies have changed and improved the quality of life of those with disabilities who have already been born, practices and policies in medicine and public health have very aggressively actually succeeded in taking life away from large numbers of infants with disabilities, so denying them access to the human community at the most basic level. To give you just a quick sense of what I mean here of some of these developments, in 1983, for example, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommended that that prenatal screening for women over the age of 35 be carried out. By 2007, it was recognized that a lot of infants were kind of slipping under the radar of this testing process, so this recommendation was changed so that prenatal screening would be offered to all pregnant women. In 2011, a non-invasive blood test was announced that would detect fetal DNA in maternal blood, promising earlier, sort of less invasive and accurate risk-free detection of children with disabilities. The number of conditions we can detect has also increased. Current technology allows for testing of hundreds of subchromosomal defects, sort of deletions and duplications of small sections of chromosomes. I've been saying for the past few years that autism is going to be the next on the list for prenatal screening, and I don't think this is in clinical use yet, but there are genetic tests for some biomarkers associated with autism that have been developed. One of these tests was developed by LabCorp, a company who regularly offers prenatal testing for children with Down syndrome. And this is alarming on its own, but it's also especially alarming given the fact that the most these tests can do is identify an increased likelihood for some form of autism. And obviously, it's not the screening for these conditions that's problematic. Diagnosis is typically a good thing in medicine, but the fact that a large percentage of children with a disability are aborted. We have the best data in our country on Down syndrome. It's estimated that somewhere between 67 and 90% of infants lose their lives after being diagnosed with Down syndrome. In other countries, the rate is consistently higher, and most of us are familiar with the story of Denmark, right, which has succeeded in eliminating individuals with Down syndrome almost entirely through prenatal testing and abortion. And yet, Denmark considers itself an inclusive society, right? Which brings me to the question of how to understand the gulf that exists between publicly expressed attitudes towards disability and private decisions of parents to end these lives. We have very inclusive societies, right? And yet very exclusive parents. We welcome those with disabilities, right? Just not always into that most intimate, sort of fundamental unit of society, which is the family. The dilemma here can be highlighted perhaps by an experience I had in a Senate hearing a few years back. A representative from the ARC, which is, most of you probably know, it's a longtime advocate for those of children with disabilities, was arguing that abortion of these children needed to remain legal. Their public policy, their stance is pro-abortion. But at the same time, this person was adamant that the word retarded, right, not be used in any of the legislative texts. So it struck me that we're in a very difficult place, right, when we can't recognize the moral difference between calling a child names and killing her. This gap, the reason for this gap, I think, between professed attitudes towards disability and actual practice in prenatal medicine gets at the heart of the question posed to our panel today. The issue of abortion and disability is a complicated one, but I think it's safe to say that we accept those with disabilities, right, as long as any claim they make on us is limited, as long as we don't owe them too much. Parents especially are daunted, right, by what might be owed here, faced with the possibility of a bond with another human being who's going to make radical, right, potentially lifelong claims on their time, finances, and energy. Parents overwhelmingly choose to sever this bond before birth. Abortion is not only legal, but it's also presented by physicians as the most rational, humane choice. In fact, it may be considered inhumane, almost cruel to insist that these parents owe their children life when the personal cost is so great. So what do we owe those with disabilities? Keeping in mind here that the burden falls disproportionately on families, at least initially, and perhaps for life. Do we even have any right to pursue this question? Well, what if, though, parents who are given a poor prenatal diagnosis have been miscalculating the cost all along? What if what they truly owe their children is so simple yet so transformative that it makes parenting these children not only possible, but joyful even? What if the very giving of the thing that's owed lightened the burdens of obligation, such that goods are no longer owed but freely given? In 1978, the Catholic Church in the U.S. published a pastoral statement on disability. It's been renewed and updated every 10 years since, and even though it was written for the church, I think it has much broader implications. In fact, it influenced the Americans with Disabilities Act. And my reading of it is that what we owe those with disabilities are two things: understanding of and working to alleviate any suffering, any difficulties, and an understanding of their potential. Providentially, the first time I read this statement was in 2016, which was a year of mercy in our church. And mercy in the Catholic tradition, as you know, is firmly rooted in friendship. I'm not a Thomist, but I'm married to one, so that's where I get this information. And so it struck me that we are called to reach out to those in mercy with disabilities, to respond to any suffering. And when we do so in friendship. And doing this, we make their suffering our own. We work for their good as our friends. So at the same time, then, this friendship allows us to recognize the potential of those with disability, the true potential of the person with a disability, I think, which is the possibility to enter into a relationship with us, the possibility to love and be loved. So I think we can actually simplify this pastoral statement, as well as our obligation to those with disabilities, to one thing, the same thing we owe everyone: friendship, the very heart of mercy. Friendship not only works to secure the goods of those we're friends with and alleviate any suffering, but the mutual exchange of gifts and friendship sustains us in difficulties and most often leaves us richer than we were before. And I think the lived experience of families who don't choose to terminate pregnancies, or who have an unexpected encounter with a child with a disability, perhaps after birth, bears this out. When children are met in friendship, and this is not difficult, in families, parental love rises unbidden, in most cases as pure gift. The cost of the disability is not considered. Instead, the parents meet the needs of the child as best they can. Friendship, and not obligation, leads them on. There might be suffering, certainly, challenges, sacrifices, but also incalculable riches from encountering the other. So much so that I'm really inclined to use Josh's turn of phrase here, as I think most families would. What do we owe those with disabilities? What do I owe my son who has Down syndrome and autism? We owe them everything. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was beautiful. We look forward to unpacking even more of it in our conversation. Michael, why don't we turn over to you now?
Thank you, Lisa. I just want to say very briefly thank you to Carter Sneed and to Margaret Cabanis and everyone at the Center for Ethics and Culture. It's a privilege for me to be able to participate in this panel. With my time today, I want to try to do two things. First, I want to take a few minutes to analyze our theme, what we owe people with disabilities, and then second, I want to offer some constructive suggestions about some specific things that I think we owe that are really important in this particular cultural moment. And in good Thomistic fashion, I will have 3 points under each heading. So let me begin with the analytic work. I want to take a little time to break down our prompt, what we owe those with disabilities, and look at some of the key terms. In particular, I want to look at the terms disabilities, we, and owe. So let's start with disabilities. I think we need to be very careful not to treat disabilities as a monolithic category. There are, of course, lots of different kinds of disabilities. There are mobility disabilities, sensory disabilities, intellectual disabilities. There are disabilities that are congenital and disabilities that are acquired. And what we owe someone who has a disability might vary significantly, I think, depending on what kind of disability we're talking about. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. Similarly, what we owe those who have disabilities might vary depending on who the we is that we're talking about. Are we talking about what we as fellow citizens owe people who have disabilities? Or are we talking about what we as Catholics owe people who have disabilities? Are we talking about what we as parents owe people with disabilities, as Mary and I and Lisa have lived that relationship? Or are we talking about what, say, siblings owe people with disabilities, something Joshua has learned throughout his life? Siblings are a particularly interesting and I would say complex subset of the we's that we could be talking about, and especially if we want to use the word owe, which I want to reflect on for just a moment. Siblings typically enter into the relationship with a sibling who has a disability very early in life. In the case of a younger sibling, that relationship is there from the very beginning. And I worry that if we think of someone as coming into life owing something to someone else, a sibling say, that it might make it more difficult for that person to receive her life as a gift in the richest form of the richest sense of the word. Now, I don't mean to suggest that there are no responsibilities or obligations that we don't choose. I think that there are. I'm just not sure that I want to use the language of owing to describe the relationship between a sibling who has a disability and a sibling who doesn't. It's not the way that I would want my typically developing daughter to conceptualize her relationship with her two sisters. Now, I want to just kind of take a moment there to gesture towards something Joshua said. I think one of the really interesting things in the way that Joshua has approached this question is to ask, what do we owe them, not in the sense of some sort of duty or obligation, but as a kind of gratitude, right? Because they've given us so much. And I think that's an interesting way to look at this prompt. I also think that Carter Sneed has a really nice way of framing the issue that I'm concerned about here in his new book, What It Means to Be Human, which I recommend to everyone. Carter lists a number of ways in which each of us have been recipients of care that we could never hope to repay, care that's given, to use Carter's words, without condition or calculation. And he explains how receiving care of this sort could awaken in us a sense of gratitude, a sense that a fitting response to receiving this kind of care would be to become the kind of person who's capable of giving that care to others. And here I want to quote Carter. He says, we become the kind of people who are giving that care to others, quote, not because it satisfies a balance owed, but because this is what it means to become one who is responsive to others solely because of their needs, without calculation or self-interest, end of quotation. I like that language better than the language of owing, at least when we're talking about the sibling relationship. If I may, I might suggest that that's sort of a virtue ethics approach to thinking about this issue, though I think it could also be worked out as a matter of natural law. Now, with all of that said, I also want to offer a few constructive suggestions about things that I think we owe people with disabilities that are particularly important to be mindful of in our current cultural moment. First, I think we owe all members of the human species a presumption of personhood. If we define person, as Boethius did in the classical definition, as the Catholic Church still does today, as an individual substance of a rational nature, and if we conceive of human nature as entailing the capacity for reason, then of course it follows that every living human being is a person, right? Even if some of them are what Pia Matthews has called apparently non-acting persons, they're still persons. This is vitally important because some of the most fraught ethical and legal battles that are being fought in the disability community today turn on the question of who counts as a person. This is true with respect to beginning of life issues, such as the ones that Mary works with, prenatal diagnosis and so-called therapeutic abortion. Is also true with respect to end-of-life issues, including ones that Lisa and I have both worked on, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, which some of you might not know, but people who have chronic disabilities, not fatal conditions, but chronic disabilities, are now in some countries being, as they say, offered access to assisted suicide. So this is a very real issue in the disability community. I think, though, that a presumption of personhood would also bear on any number of more mundane issues, such as the right to education. Why do we have an Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? What's the foundation for that need? Or the right to work? And this is because if we presume personhood, along with all of the capacities that are shared by all human beings, then it's easier to understand why education and opportunities to work are owed to people with disabilities. And if we don't presume personhood there, it's much easier for people to deny those kinds of opportunities on the grounds of an assumption that people with certain kinds of disabilities simply might not be able to benefit from them. If we assume personhood, I think that also lays the foundation for friendship. And here I'm going to dovetail a little bit with some of the things that Mary has said. And like Mary's husband, I am a Thomist. So let me begin with just a quick reference to St. Thomas. St. Thomas teaches that friendship and love begin in a recognition of likeness or similarity with the other. And recognizing individuals who have even the most profound forms of disabilities as fellow human persons seems to me to be the first step toward friendship and love. And I would propose that as Catholics, we owe friendship to people with disabilities. Scripture tells us that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, which has always struck me as being remarkably similar to Aristotle's idea of the highest form of friendship, what he calls friendship of virtue, something that happens, he says, when we love the friend as another self, right? We love the friend as another self. Now, if we live up to the scriptural injunction to love our neighbors as ourselves, which is to say, if we treat these people as friends in the fullest Aristotelian sense of the term, then we will inevitably begin to seek the good of people with disabilities as our own good. And as Mary has already suggested, I think that can fundamentally change how people with disabilities are received in society. Now, when we pursue the good of people with disabilities as our own good, it will inevitably follow also that we will want all of the goods of a full human life for these people. And that would include education, healthcare, friendship, family, which is an important topic, marriage, children, being fully included in the community. And I would add opportunities for meaningful work as well. In fact, I would go so far as to suggest that meaningful work, or at least the opportunity for meaningful work, is another thing that we owe people with disabilities. In Laborum Exercens, Pope St. John Paul II says that work is a fundamental right of all human beings. And he specifically notes that people with disabilities have a right to professional training and to work. This is an especially important issue in the autism community right now because the rate of unemployment among adults on the spectrum is extremely high. Estimates run anywhere between 50 and 80%. And that's actually significantly higher than it is for people with intellectual disabilities. I think if we subscribe to the notion that we owe people with disabilities meaningful work or opportunities for meaningful work, I think that would be a very good first step in the direction of making headway on this problem. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully the three of us have planted enough seeds that something interesting will pop up in discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciated all of your comments and your ways of framing some of the challenges and your inquiry into the theme and the question and the prompt here. You have certainly raised a couple of questions in my mind, and the first that I want to pose to all three of you has to do with the notion of friendship that all of you have alluded to in some way, saying that what we owe people with disabilities is friendship. All of us have experience. We're all preaching to the choir, this panel here, right? Because we all have been placed in positions in our lives where we had people thrust into our orbits of love and family at a very early age. People who I think we should reveal to the audience. All of our loved ones with disabilities have significantly complex disabilities, and I think almost all of them have a touch of autism, which sometimes impairs the ability to have relationship. At least that's what the common knowledge, that's what the common understanding is. But we all have had the gift of having family relationships with people with disabilities, and they let us learn the value of those relationships firsthand because they were thrust upon us. Do you think it's realistic to think that we can convince people that are not forcibly members of that choir to understand the importance of those relationships? Practically, how can we do that?
Well, I think to bring all of this together, we talk about how we develop gratitude and friendship and love, and to do those things, the first and most basic way to do that is to improve access to the community for people with disabilities. And access can be looked at in a lot of ways. It could be in terms of, being able to navigate the community, to be able to access, work opportunities and training, or at a very basic level, being born. And so with this question, we're talking about access. And what's interesting is that in my experience, I've seen that simply from providing opportunities to include people with disabilities in the community and taking active steps to do it is something that really moves real people to feel gratitude and friendship and love. And all of us vary in terms of our ability to develop friendships. What seems to be a big obstacle for a lot of people with developmental disabilities is access. Sometimes that access is physically being able to get to where they need to go. Sometimes the access is maybe not having the skills to be able to participate in work. And sometimes that access is communication. So finding the supports for people so they can have that access is key.
I would say that, as a parent, I've discovered it's really very important to share my children with the community. I actually believe that I'm doing something good for the world by letting people meet my daughters. And just, briefly, I'll say I have 3 daughters, and 2 of them have a range of diagnoses, including autism. I think that one of the most powerful instances that I can think of making headway toward this kind of inclusion in the community and developing friendship really has to do with the increasingly widespread policy of full inclusion in public schools. I think it makes a tremendous difference when you encounter people with disabilities at a normal age and on a daily basis, because that normalizes it. Right, that makes this something which is not extraordinary. It's not hidden away or secret. It's something that it's sort of been there from the very beginning. And I've been a professor now for just over 20 years, and I've noticed a significant difference in my students over that time. At the beginning of my career, if I had a classroom of say 30 students and we were talking about intellectual disability, I would say maybe 3 to 5 students would have had some personal experience with that, maybe a sibling or a cousin or a neighbor, and the other 25 or so would have been, sort of clueless. Now I think it's just the opposite. In a classroom of 30 students, I would say probably 25 or more will have had that firsthand experience. And a lot of it is a result of full inclusion in schools. I don't want to take too much more time, but I could tell you any number of heartwarming stories about the way that typically developing children who don't have disabilities have responded to my daughters in school, especially my daughter Olivia, who has what I describe as the most robust set of challenges. And these stories are heartwarming, not just because of what it does for Olivia, but because you can see that she's made a tremendous impact on the lives of those other children.
Mary, do you have anything to add? You're muted.
Thank you. In the Gospels, Christ's Good Samaritan was the one who responded to the suffering person in his path. And so, one way to think about this question is to think about the people who naturally will encounter those with disabilities. Although certainly like Josh and Michael, I think we need to think about what the barriers are to those encounters. But let me start with the area that I'm most familiar with, because the stakes are so high, right, for friendship with the child in utero, as we've seen. The baby in utero who has just been diagnosed with some congenital anomaly, who encounters this child as he waits, right, completely vulnerable for a sentence to be passed on his life? Who can he hope will turn to him in mercy? Primarily the physician and the parents, right, maybe a geneticist. And so you think the story, right, should have a happy ending. The baby's fate depends on one who has devoted his whole life to caring for others and to the two people who have conceived him in love and, should be fiercely protective of him. So how can this go so horribly wrong? It seems much more egregious, certainly, than the priest and the Levite, right, crossing to the other side of the road to avoid the wounded traveler in the parable. And it's tempting to despair, because if we think, if these people cannot be moved by the plight of the child, who can? But I'm absolutely convinced that the child with Down syndrome, with cystic fibrosis, with anencephaly, with any disorder, deserves the friendship of her parents and her doctor. And I'm equally convinced that it's a worthwhile project and entirely possible to secure this friendship. A couple of reasons for my hope. 3 of the leading pioneers in prenatal diagnostic techniques were completely committed to the care of their young patients. Included in these was Jerome Lejeune, for example, who discovered the chromosomal basis of Down syndrome and spent the rest of his career trying to save those children who he realized would be compromised now because of his discovery. He tirelessly proclaimed that every patient is my brother. And I have to believe that it's still possible to awaken the sleeping giant, right? That is the moral imagination of physicians. And we're seeing some evidence. There is a doctor who works for the NIH, Diana Bianchi, who has been doing some early research into treating children with Down syndrome in utero. Let me give you also one quick hopeful statistic with regards to parents in terms of being capable of this friendship. Without intervention, about 80% of children or parents will choose abortion in the case of the most severe diagnosis, life-limiting diagnosis, things like trisomy 13, 18, anencephaly, etc., without any intervention. When a supportive model of compassionate care called perinatal hospice is offered, about 80% of these children will actually choose to carry these infants to term norm. And I think that's because this resonates with them very deeply, at a very deep level. Any of us who are parents know that when we encounter our child who is sick, that's when the rubber hits the road of parenting, right? That's when we mobilize and we'll do anything to help our child. So I think it's just really giving the parents the support, offering them an alternative model, and really just tapping into the deep instincts of parents to enter into this friendship with their child. So absolutely, I think it's possible and of course, vital to do this.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something that Michael said in response to my first question. You talked about the friendships that are developing in public schools because of children being in communion with people with disabilities because of inclusion from day one. That's not always the case in our Catholic schools, though. And I myself have had that experience of the lack of inclusion in educational opportunities, even in faith formation programs for my son with a disability. And what I bemoan and what breaks my heart about that is often that the people of the parish that has not been so welcoming, that they lose that opportunity for the friendship and they lose the witness of the gifts. Like you, Michael, I sometimes think a part of my job is to have Peter, my son, in public places so that people have to confront him. And I enjoy so much taking him with us to things like our big fancy yearly fundraising gala for the church. I think he's part of our family and he should be there. And when he makes noises or sings or insists on loudly repeating the last word of every line of every prayer, it never embarrasses me. I think it's great. I think that churches need that witness. It breaks my heart. My local Catholic school, I chose to send my daughter to, my youngest daughter to, because I heard that they were reaching out for a child, to include a child with Down syndrome in her class. That the nuns, they were actually actively recruiting a young lady with Down syndrome. But that's not always the case. And the reason that I did not send my older children to Catholic schools was because they were not interested in having my son, and I didn't feel that that was right. So what do we as a Catholic community think about that? If we owe our children our children with disabilities acceptance and inclusion, yet we're not embracing them in our schools, are we losing the opportunity to teach our communities and our parishes about the reciprocal idea of owing that Carter Sneed has discussed and that you have discussed, Michael?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you've said, Lisa. I think it is it's a scandal in the church. It's shameful. Certainly, our family has had the experience, and it sounds like maybe you and Mary have had the experience of looking for placements in Catholic schools for our daughters, only to be told that they just don't have the support that they need. And so this is very painful for me, actually, as a Catholic, but we made the decision a long time ago that since we wanted, if it were possible, to have all three of our daughters go through the same schools, develop relationships with the teachers and so forth, that we had to go to public school, because that was really the only option for our daughters who have special needs. Now, I will say it's gotten better, in the last 10 years or so, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. I think oftentimes money is a problem, but I think that there are opportunities to think creatively there that would allow us to do more with less. And I think we simply need to do that. It's a moral imperative for us to do that. For our part, there's only so much I can do about the Catholic schools, but we're active in the parish, and I make sure that my daughters are included in the liturgy. Both of my daughters were able to go through catechesis and receive confirmation. In fact, they're twins, and so they were confirmed on the same day. Their older sister was their sponsor. It was really a beautiful thing for our family. Powerful, moving. We're fortunate, though, that for our daughter whose challenges are more mild, we were able to sort of create supports within the existing religious educational structure and get her through the program. For our daughter whose needs are more robust, our parish has actually developed a special needs catechesis program, which has been an extraordinary blessing for our family. So I think that we have to continue to show up. We have to take advantage of the opportunities that are available to us to facilitate these kinds of encounters and handle them in the right way when they happen. I mentioned the other day, it very often happens that I will see children who are sitting around us at Mass kind of looking at my youngest daughter, and they're not looking at her in a judgmental way. They're just sort of trying to figure out what her deal is. And when I see that, I always try to take the opportunity to introduce the children after Mass and let them know her name. And if they have questions, we answer the questions. And invariably, it's a short conversation, and they just come to understand, okay, that's who she is, and she's one of us. And they say hello to her and shake her hand at the sign of peace, and so on. So I think we just have to keep doing what we can do in that regard, while continuing to hold those who have power to do more accountable, to let them know that we really do need to be doing more and to do it better.
Thank you.
I agree.
Mary?
That's a huge glaring hole in our church's response to those with disabilities. And, we look great on paper, right, in terms of, the pastoral statement of those with disabilities. In my own field, the church is very clear that we must welcome these children into our families. But what I find is that, I encourage parents to welcome, the children into their little families, their domestic church. And then many families take these children in good faith into their parish and find that they're not welcome. And I think education is the biggest hole. And I absolutely agree with you, Lisa, that the biggest tragedy is that the other students in the Catholic schools don't receive the gift of our children. And, I think Michael is right. It is about money on one hand, and yet it's not about money, right? We need to make the priority, and the money will follow. And, Catholic schools are great. The church is great at doing this in general. Parishes are good. If there's a need, right? We have a fundraiser. We have trivia nights. We have a capital campaign. We'll build a new gym, right? We'll get new sports uniforms. We'll do all sorts of things. But where is our treasure, right? Our treasure is in these children with disabilities. And are we willing, right, to pay the price to have them with us? You think that so many parents don't want the cost or are afraid of what these children will cost them. Well, the church, the parishes, our priests are also afraid, I think, of what this is going to cost. If you talk to a priest and say, please, can we have my child here? Can we have children with disabilities? They'll say, I'm really sorry. We just don't have the money. We don't have the resources. The teachers, it would overwhelm the teachers. Absolutely. Maybe it would, just like it overwhelms many families. And yet, we do it. Why? Because the gifts are without measure, and we believe that these children are members of the body of Christ, and frankly, we need each other desperately, right, to work out our salvation. And there's no way we're going to be the evangelist Michael Kelly uses this, or Matthew Kelly uses this term, the best version of ourselves. Well, the church is never going to be the best version of itself without our children, without those with disabilities. It's not possible, right? We need each other very much.
Josh, I want to hear from you too, but I want to expand this question a little bit more in an area that you might have a little. You're engaged sort of more in the outside of the world, not just into the church. And there's one question that's come in that broadens the question a little bit. So I'm going to pose it to you, Josh, but also ask you if you have anything that you want to add in reaction to what we just heard from either Michael or Mary. One of the participants asked this: how can our acceptance and openness and friendship with those with disabilities be a model for openness to the other within our currently horribly divisive society? Similarly, how is society's willingness to discard them propagating our disregard for others different from us?
Yeah, and I think I can tie that into what we were just talking about. I think, previously it sounds like the Catholic schools are struggling with the wrong question right now. If you think about the beginning of the discussions about whether or not to include people with developmental disabilities in the school, the question was whether we should include them and not how we can include them. And, there are some things that are harder. But as a local elementary school puts it, we can do hard things. And there are things that we can do both in terms of financial, but both in terms of infrastructure to be able to better include people with developmental disabilities. And I think that ties into the question. And, it's almost like the question answers itself, right? I think we're really quick to discard things that are different from us, whether they be opinions or looks or things that might make us uncomfortable, that we're unfamiliar with. And the only way to get around that is to become familiar with them. In a practical sense for people with developmental disabilities, it's, providing opportunities, like Dr. Waddell said, for us to engage people who might have questions. And in many ways, they're innocent questions. And, on a political sense, it's not just listening to, one channel. It's not just going into CNN or Fox News, but trying to embrace all types of discussion. One of the things that's always frustrating for me in that sense is, why can't we talk about politics civilly at Christmas? Like, that's like the unspoken rule that you're not supposed to talk about politics, right? I feel like we run into the same situations with people with developmental disabilities. I feel like there are times that are scripted that we can talk about my brother. And oftentimes I feel like people with developmental disabilities are talked about when they're not there, like not including people in their individual education plan, not talking about what's an appropriate placement for them in terms of a job, or what they can do or what they can't do, or what's the best living situation for them. So it's almost scripted when we would talk about people with developmental disabilities and when we wouldn't. And I don't think that that's right. I don't think there should be appropriate or inappropriate times to talk about people. I think that creates barriers to access that I've talked about so much.
I think
that is intriguing.
So just to follow up on that, and also on something Mary said, I think one of the reasons we can't talk about politics at Christmas is because we've never talked about politics at Christmas. What I mean is, I think we've become incredibly bad at civil political discourse because for years we've been told it's not polite to talk about politics. It's not polite to talk about faith. And I think we've now raised a couple generations of people who have a great deal of difficulty talking about faith with other people as well. So, in some sense, we just have to start doing it, and then we can develop the virtues of doing it well. Just a quick reference to what Mary was saying. I think it's helpful to think about, the issue of integrating people with disabilities in the Catholic schools in terms of the preferential option for the poor, or what we might call the preferential option of the marginalized. Yesterday, there was a panel on race, and Ernest Morel made some really interesting comments about how impactful Catholic schools have been in the African American community. I think we don't always live up to the best version of ourselves, but I think we at least try with the Catholic schools to make sure that communities that have less economic resources have opportunities to send children to Catholic schools. I think we at least try, to be inclusive of race and other populations of people who might be underserved. Why don't we think of people who have disabilities as a group that's been marginalized and therefore include them under the umbrella of the preferential option for the poor? I also want to say, just in reference to the the question that you added, Lisa, the person who sent the question to us. It's interesting that historically, eugenics began by targeting people who have disabilities and expanded from there to ethnicity and race. So the question of whether being open and inclusive and developing friendship with people with disabilities might have an impact on our broader civil discourse, I think that's a really interesting question, because we've seen historically that the one in fact did lead to the other.
Very interesting. I just want to also add on your point on thinking about people with disabilities in the same context as like the preferential option for the poor. The statistics of poverty rates for people with disability are phenomenal. I mean, the group of people with disabilities generally are among the poor, and that has to do with for many reasons, including the structures that we've set in place for assisting people with disability that require people
Right.
to stay to keep their incomes below certain levels in order to receive the assistance that they need to get through the Medicaid system. That's a real problem for people who are capable of doing a lot, and I've had conversations with very capable people with disabilities who have a woman who just got a PhD and wanted to set up a consulting firm. But the trouble was, if she earned too much money with that, she was going to lose all of the support she needed in order to keep living. So one of the issues related to that, though, is work. And a couple of you have mentioned the importance of work for people with disabilities. And Josh, your job is to support people. One of your jobs is to support people with disabilities in work. So I'd like to get your views briefly on a really controversial topic on disability rights policy right now relating to work. And that's the elimination of the minimum wage exemption for employers who offer certain kinds of employment for people with disabilities. Advocates for eliminating the exemption argue that there's no justification for denying minimum wage to anybody at all, that the elimination of that exemption supports the dignity of all workers. Opponents of eliminating it argue that some people with disabilities will lose the possibility of any kind of a work that gives their lives daily meaning and dignity, and that will be lost if employers don't have the ability to make some economic adjustments to wages that reflect capabilities. Where do you think the robust Catholic notion of the dignity of work guides us in this debate? Maybe we'll start with Joshua.
Well, I think a little bit of context here is appropriate for people that aren't as familiar with this issue. One of the major reasons that we even have to talk about this issue is the fact that there were organizations that were taking advantage of contracts that they had and cheap labor to be able to make a profit off of people with developmental disabilities. And I think we can all agree that that is wrong. And that is its own separate issue that really needs to be set aside. Now, then the question that once we do that, then I think with a clear mind, we can talk about how the basics of this issue without getting as impassioned about what were clearly wrongs. I think the hard and practical struggle that you run into that you referenced is that, we really want as many businesses to engage with us as an organization to help our individuals with developmental disabilities develop the skills that they need to achieve their desired vocation. And for many individuals with developmental disabilities, this is a step-by-step process. To a certain extent, we start by, just learning basic soft job skills. And then it goes to, working on very specific skills that they need to then be able to pursue whatever vocation they want to pursue. And then another step is convincing local businesses to help bring individuals with developmental disabilities who are still developing their skills along with their job coach into their own community, into their own organization. And I say this because every single one of those steps is really important. Thinking of something as like where do you start paying full wage versus this is not there's no wage that's being paid here. The way the system is set up right now, when it's done right, one of the steps on that progress is if you're able to work for 5 minutes and then you need to take a break, you can still be recognized, for that work and be paid for that production that you're able to do. It also ties what you're working on with some sort of outcome for you, some sort of positive outcome for you. And so, the benefits of doing something like that is, it makes a more natural part of the learning process. Where the problem often lies is getting people from that workshop into the community. And so you have a lot of individuals who are stuck with the skills that they need to be able to go into the community, but they're having trouble accessing the community. Some of that is on the organization, but some of that is, getting the community and getting the opportunities for people to be able to go out into the community. So I think, when you look at it from, a theme, everybody deserves that same opportunity to be paid and valued in the same way. But everybody has strengths and areas in need of support. So how do we best get individuals with developmental disabilities to the point where they can achieve what their goals are?
Great. Michael or Mary, would you like to weigh in on this?
Mary, do you want to go?
You're muted. Okay.
Yeah, they asked me to mute in between. Sorry. Michael, you go ahead. I have a few thoughts, but I think this might be a little bit more your area.
Well, so, just to kind of underscore, I think something that, Joshua was saying there may be some points in that continuum of development where something like sub-minimum wage is actually, appropriate or necessary, right? I think that if we, to harken back to what I said earlier, I think that if we, that is to say the community, begin to think in terms of people having a right to meaningful work, then that should open up more opportunities in the community to receive people who are ready to make that transition that Joshua was talking about into a community-based job or work rather than maybe a workshop-based employment. I also think that it's important, though. So when I said that we owe people with disabilities a right to meaningful work, notice that I didn't say employment. I think that there's a distinction to be made between meaningful work and employment. Joshua talks about helping people realize the vocation that they want for themselves. I think that's a nice way to think about it. I think, Pope St. John Paul II said that for all of us, for all human beings, the original vocation was to work, but it was a very particular kind of work. He said the dignity of human work fundamentally comes from the fact that it's the way that we actualize our potential as beings who are created in the image and likeness of God to participate in God's creative activity. That's what gives human work its fundamental dignity. Now, you can do that without being paid. Right? As I often point out, those of us who have children, I think we would probably say that the most meaningful work that we do is parenting. But that's not something that we're paid for. So I think that to me, what we fundamentally owe people with disabilities is opportunities for meaningful work. How that relates to wages or employment, I think, is another matter. And I think that we probably need to think more creatively about that than we have in the past. I think we tend to think myopically about a wage, typically an hourly wage or a salary paid by a direct employer. Pope St. John Paul II talks about the difference between a direct employer and an indirect employer. Maybe we need to think about the funding to support these people as coming from indirect employers rather than from the direct employer, say. I'll stop there.
So this is a little bit outside my area, but I just had, a couple of thoughts. First of all, in our Down syndrome community, I've observed that the most difficult transition is the one from high school to adult life. Individuals are leaving behind, full-time structure, support, stimulation, peers and friends. Typically, comparable environments are not available for these individuals to move into. And so you might think also that in addition to the primary goods that work provides, dignity, meaningful activity, et cetera, it's important to note the secondary goods that we find there, their access to work, friends and social contacts and support, et cetera. So that's important. And the second point I want to make is that, there are economic judgments made about disabilities which are very disturbing. Especially regards the prevailing stereotypes that regarding disabilities and employment. In two different contexts I've seen, there's been an assumption of absolutely zero employment rate. The first case, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but is in the cost effectiveness research of prenatal screening programs. The research paradigm is incredibly crass, right? But the idea is that a screening program, the prenatal screening program, is cost effective if the costs saved by aborting children with disabilities exceed the expenses of administering the program. So this means that the cost of the child, right, has to be calculated, right, in order to enter into this equation. It's calculated as a lifetime figure. I've heard different figures. But for example, a child with Down syndrome is expected to cost the system about between $300,000 and $700,000, something like that, over the course of the lifetime. And so my point here is just that lives of individuals with cognitive disabilities are almost without exception, considered as a debit to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this assumption forms the basis of life and death decisions, right, in prenatal diagnosis, despite the fact that, for example, the statistics may vary, as you said, Michael, in autism, but recent data shows that 56% of individuals with Down syndrome have paid employment of some kind. Similarly, in every legislative hearing I've been in regarding prenatal diagnosis and abortion bans, at some point, a senator who opposes these bans will say to me, I just can't go back and tell my constituents that we are going to have to pay taxes for these individuals who would live, right, as a result of these bans. So again, in a context where life and death are being regulated, there's a lot of faulty assumptions persisting that individuals with disabilities don't contribute. And obviously, we have to be careful here. I'm always careful because we certainly can't argue that individuals deserve to live because they contribute financially. But at the same time, there needs to be a recognition that these individuals contribute in various ways, and in part in economic ways. And I'm not sure why, let's say, I think there's been like a good 50 years of cost effectiveness research, why that assumption is still in there, right? And not challenged, why nobody's challenging these legislators who simply see these kind of discussions as pitting taxpayers, right, against the disabled. Just something to think about.
Just something very quickly. Mary gestures toward the fact that there are other goods that a person can get from work, from the wage, friendship, and participation in the community. There are other goods that the organization can receive from the employee as well. And I think we really do need, not only do we need to stop thinking about the value of people who have disabilities merely in financial terms, I also think we need to urge people who run companies and various sorts of organizations to think about what they do in a broader way. Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame used to have a kind of marketing slogan that was business for the common good. I rather like that. I think if we think of our businesses and organizations not just as being fundamentally about earning profit, although they generally need to do that, but also as about playing a role in society, contributing to the common good. I think that there are ways that they can contribute to the common good by including people with disabilities that really can't be understood just in dollars and cents.
Sounds like a very, very fruitful avenue for any economists who might be in the audience to start exploring. Both of the issues that Mary and Michael have raised, I think, are really important questions to be asking, and very, very much related to the value of family work in general, and the contributions of parenting to society, and what value should be placed upon that. I have a question that I wanted to pose that's coming from our audience. We have so many good questions coming in, and I'm not going to be able to get all of them in. But before I do that, just one thing, I want to make sure that Mary's first point in her response is not overlooked by anybody. That area of transition into adulthood out of high school is an area of where support for families and support for people with disabilities just disappears. And our parishes ought to be very, very cognizant of that too. So how many of our parishes include people with disabilities in their young adult groups? We're trying to reach out, or their older adult groups. I don't think very many, and that's really important. And Josh, you probably have experience with that too, that's a time in which a lot of families are just left alone. One of our questions that we have from the audience is about that. What is the proper role of the family as a unit in promoting the value of children and individuals with disabilities? In a current culture that has seen a marked decrease in marriage, childbirth, and a stable family structure, how can working for the family help work for those with disabilities, or vice versa?
That feels like a Mary and Josh question to me.
And and let me just add another question to that, a really practical one that one of our participants asks. What advice could you offer for families who might feel overwhelmed by the difficulties of raising a child with a disability? How would you offer encouragement or support?
Well, I have a lot to say on both, so I'm not going to, I was trying to be respectful on this. To answer the second question first is that you're not alone. And there is support out there for you. It can often feel like you're isolated, but there are more people that are in your situation than you know. But related to that, I think we have to be careful to understand that just like every individual is different, every family is different in terms of their ability and situation to be able to provide the supports that their loved one with a disability need. And I think that we need to be cognizant of that as a community. I think as a family, we all have complex relationships with our loved ones, and people within families take roles of caregivers. And some people don't. So I think, within your family, I think, as much as possible within the family unit, whatever that family unit is, making sure, as much as possible that there is a plan for that individual and that they're involved in that plan, whatever their needs for support are. And I think as a community and as a culture, we have to recognize that not all families have the wherewithal to provide all the supports that individual might need. So we need to play a role in identifying the families that need support and providing what's needed for them.
Mary, did you have something to say?
Well, I was going to say that, and Josh makes good on his word. I mean, I found myself in Josh's office one day when my son had recently been diagnosed with autism, asking him for help. And I think it's absolutely important that families reach out when they need it. I tend to be very independent. I homeschooled my children. I was homeschooling my child with Down syndrome and autism, and his behaviors got overwhelming for me. And I definitely needed help and found out so many good resources. And now my son's in a very good structured sort of ABA behavior therapy program where he is really doing well and thriving. Another source of support I found just invaluable is other parents with disabilities. I have kind of a group of friends. We almost consider ourselves kind of a secretive group because we're all in our Down syndrome group, but we almost meet without telling anybody else because our children don't even fit into the Down syndrome group, right? Maybe like you, Lisa. Our children have extra diagnoses diagnoses like autism. So we kind of meet at somebody's house and we support each other. And, we end up actually having a lot of fun and laughing. But, we understand each other when we say, yeah, I've got dents in my woodwork too because my son throws. But that's been a huge a source of support. So I think, any ways we can facilitate families coming together to help each other out. It helps to talk about things and find things in common. Right away, when we find out that somebody has been, a new parent has been diagnosed with disability of Down syndrome, our Down syndrome group reaches out to that parent, provides them with, books and materials and resources and mostly just friendship, really. So that's a huge source of support as well.
I want to emphasize that. There are groups called, there was a group when I was a young mom with a child with disability, Mothers from Hell, who would get together. And we've had various groups of predominantly mothers, but it should be fathers too, who provide the best support. I would like to share a story. When I also grew up with an older brother with disabilities. So I was part of the club before I got the diagnosis, the prenatal diagnosis that my son would have Down syndrome. And when I called my mother, who raised my older brother, was told to put him in a home and didn't. It was before we even had ADA or IDEA. She raised him through that. When I told her that I had been, that I'd received this diagnosis, the very first thing she said to me, it wasn't, "Oh, God, won't give you anything more than you could handle," or "He's a little angel." The first thing she said to me was, "Oh, Lisa, you're going to meet such wonderful people." That's what she said to me, and it struck me, and it has been true it's been true through my entire journey of raising my son. You meet such wonderful people, and the friendships that you develop through that, if you allow yourself to reach out and ask for help, it can be truly amazing. Mm-hmm. We are almost out of time, but I'm going to ask one more question of the panelists that's come in from our audience. And hopefully this is a little shorter and a little less complicated, so we can fit it in our time. In regards to referring to people with disabilities when they're not present, which was Josh's point, do any of our panelists have opinions on using people first language? I was naturally drawn to people first language when I first heard of the concept because it speaks to the dignity of the person, but then later heard critiques that by using people first language, a person insinuates that disabilities diminish the value of the person. Do any of you have any thoughts about that?
Joshua and I have this conversation all the time. I'm going to let him go first, and then I will correct all his errors.
Well, it's certainly a rich question and worth discussion. I was in the same boat as you, the person asking the question, in that I was raised that we treat a person first, not a disability first. And that in many ways make a lot of sense. I think the question becomes with, some individuals who become great self-advocates that have in many ways taken their disability as part of their identity. I think the thing that complicates, saying that we should go one way or we should go the other way is that, people are at different places in that journey. And some people do not want to have their disability define them, be a part of their identity. And so I think a part of that discussion is not just listening to one group of advocates who believes one way, but looking at the whole of the picture of how to appropriately refer to people.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think, to go back to one of my opening remarks, that, the appropriate response might vary significantly depending on what kind of disability we're talking about, as well as what person we're talking to or about. So for instance, in the deaf and blind communities, there's been a widespread commitment to using what's now come to be known as identity first language rather than person first language, and that's been the case in those communities for decades now. And I think that for me, especially as an outsider, the appropriate thing for me to do is to respect that as their choice. I think in the autism community, as we're getting more and more adults on the spectrum who are self-advocates, we're hearing more and more of that. So I think that community is probably moving in that direction. But I'm also acutely aware that if I'm talking to parents or professionals, they tend to skew more toward person first language rather than identity first language. And so, when you're talking about language, context matters. And so I think you have to remember who your audience is. And fundamentally, if the language you're using offends the person you're talking to, I think it's just a matter of basic decency to use the language that they prefer.
Thank you very much. Mary, did you want to say anything?
No, I don't have a lot to add. I tend to use
Okay.
people first language, and I used to be very sensitive when people didn't, and now I really tend to look at their intention. I have a friend who often says Down syndrome baby or Down syndrome infant, and yet he's such a strong advocate for those with Down syndrome. It doesn't tend to bother me anymore. So I think it's something to think about, and especially as it affects those with disabilities. But I think we can also realize that people have goodwill. Often can make mistakes, and that's okay. So.
Well, I think that is all the time that we have, unfortunately, and we're in this virtual world, so I can offer only my thanks to all of your panelists and some virtual deaf applause from the deaf community here to all of you. And I want to thank all of the audience members for participating in our program. I also want to give you a heads up that the next panel is going to be on a topic that we've addressed a little bit here, economics in the Catholic social tradition. I hope somebody asks a good biting question about the economic analysis of the value of work. And that starts at 11 a.m. Eastern time. You log in using the same Zoom webinar link for all of your sessions. There is more information and a complete schedule at the Nicola Center's website, ethicscenter.nd.edu. I want to thank you all for your participation. I want to thank the Nicola Center for the privilege of including me in this beautiful panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.